So let's talk about Greenland and Canada. These are two different countries. Canada is a sovereign country, and Greenland is a part of Denmark. This is interesting. The United States, it began, after Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase. It was the idea of manifest destiny. The United States would keep on expanding, and that went all the way through the 1960s when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, would step foot on the moon. And, we haven't expanded at all since. In fact, we've kind of contracted, right? We've lost our presence in the Panama Canal Zone, and we're drawing down our military bases around the world. It's actually multifaceted. There's a neoconservative facet to this. There's a globalist facet to this. There is an organic Americana facet to this. I think the devil's in the details with this. So let's take a look at Greenland first. Greenland is a part of Denmark. Trump talked about buying Greenland during his first term, and I thought it was a fantastic idea. Currently, right now, you have interests from all over the world taking part in Greenland. China is one of them. They're actually trying to extract rare earth minerals from that landmass, and Denmark owns it. It's a technically it's a semi-sovereign territory where they govern, the people there govern a lot of the things that go on separate from Denmark, but nonetheless, technically it is a part of Denmark. Think about this from a business perspective. Think about if you're a businessman and you want to buy somebody else out. The person being bought out probably feels insulted unless you give them a really sweetheart deal. And that's the case in Denmark. Denmark doesn't have the resources to develop Greenland. They do punch above their weight economically and technically, but they just don't have the resources to drill under the sheet of ice, that glacier that sits on top of Greenland. The United States, however, does. We have a substantially larger population and economy. We can draw resources enough to exploit the resources that are there. Anytime you do business, price points are very important. So, when you have the technical skills to do something, your prices, you're able to operate in an environment that has, a higher cost or a higher front-loaded cost of infrastructure that would have to be built out to do whatever you're going to do. The purchase of Greenland does make sense. There are oil and natural gas resources there. There's rare earth minerals that are there, like I said, that are being exploited by China. And obviously there's a big chunk of fresh water that's there. Fresh water, by the way, is going to be a commodity in the future in some parts of the world. So anyway, that aside, it's possible. I'm sure the political elite in Denmark and the rest of Europe feel insulted by this. Imagine somebody saying, come to you and says, we're going to buy you out, right? It feels insulting. I'm sure they feel butthurt over it. But if you want to develop it and actually do it correctly and make it profitable, the United States can do a much better job with it. And I'm sure we can make a sweetheart deal with Denmark. Not to say that they're going to accept it, but there's a way that this can make sense. Now, let's move on to Canada. That's a different issue. Trump recently joked that Canada was the 51st state and Justin Trudeau was the governor. And this was just obviously an insult, like a jab type insult aimed at Trudeau. Frankly, the guy sucks. He has been unpopular in Canada for quite some time. He's been forming coalitions. The way the government works in Canada is not the same as it does in the United States. In Canada, they have a parliamentary system like they do in England. And, you can have coalitions. So they have like 5 different parties in Canada. And even if your party doesn't get the majority, you can make a coalition with other parties In the case of in Canada, they had the Liberal Party, and then they have this far left party, and they combined together just enough votes to keep Trudeau as prime minister. That is not going to happen in the next election because he's so unpopular that Canadians are voting for the Conservative Party. Now, the labels over there they're a little bit different than they are here in the United States. But anyway, that aside, there's another big difference in Canada, and that is that they have what's the word for it? I would say like a dominion type system. But anyway, they have their provinces, and each province has actually considerable sovereignty within their country. A province in Canada has more sovereignty than a state does in the United States. So, but at the same time, the way they federalize all this in Canada is they try to even it all out economically. So you have your successful provinces, being taxed at a higher rate, and then transferring those benefits to the poorer provinces in Canada. 35 years ago, or thereabouts, Quebec had a referendum whether or not to leave Canada, and it was actually very close. Quebec almost became its own separate country, and if that was the case, it would have hived off all of Canada. Well, they would have hived off the rest of Canada from the maritime provinces, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and it would have shut off the St. Lawrence River from Ontario. And had that happened, Canada would be in really bad shape right now. They'd have to make a sweetheart deal with Quebec to get to those areas. But anyway, so they're paying all this money into Quebec. That was part of the deal. It's basically they're bribing the people of Quebec, the Quebecois, as they're called, the Quebec nationalists in Canada. They are just pro-Canadian basically because they're being paid to be Canadian, and this is an arrangement that they've gotten used to over the decades. But there was another movement about a decade ago of Alberta talking about seceding from the rest of Canada, and even some talks of joining the United States. They were called the Wild Rose Party, and they were actually relatively popular in Alberta. I don't know how popular they are now, but anyway, Alberta is recently the most economically successful province, and that's because they have their tar sands where they produce their oil, and they also have a substantial agricultural sector and all the other sectors around that. Obviously, when you have oil, you have chemicals. When you have food processing, etc. So Alberta has been footing the bill for the rest of the provinces in Canada because of the demographics, because people are mass retiring in Canada, and the average age in Canada is much older than it is in the United States. Ontario and British Columbia are not as economically productive as they used to be. So, to keep these transfer payments going, they're taxing the Albertans relatively higher than everybody else. So if Alberta would have seceded, well, that would have cut off Canada from the West Coast. British Columbia, there would be no contact with the rest of Canada, so British Columbia probably would have to go as well. So, fortunately for the Canadians, that didn't happen. Alberta didn't secede. But another reason why they were talking about seceding is because building a pipeline. Well, that's pretty hard to do because in Canada, each province has a significant sovereignty, and it's not just easy to build a pipeline. Eventually, they came to the deal with British Columbia to build a pipeline over British Columbia to access the Pacific to export their oil to the Far East, the Asian countries. That's part of what Keystone Pipeline was all about. They wanted to build a pipeline to go through the United States to at least enter the American market and export out of Louisiana, Canadian oil. Had Alberta become part of the United States, it had been a lot easier to do this because now Keystone Pipeline would have been entirely a national issue instead of having to work with another country over this deal. Now, I don't think, with all this said, I don't think Canada would become a part of the United States. It's actually not as insane as it sounds because economically Canada is very much dependent on the United States, and demographically and economically and culturally, there's a lot more contact with Canada with the United States than it is anywhere in the world. And actually, in some ways, if you look at it geographically, Vancouver interacts with Seattle a lot more than Vancouver interacts with Toronto. I don't believe Canada will become a part of the United States, at least not anytime soon. And that's actually a good thing. Canada's politics is significantly different enough from the United States that it would throw this country for a loop. If you admitted all these people as American citizens, the provinces, if they were states, Alberta would be a red state, Saskatchewan would be a swing state, and the rest of the provinces would be blue states. You would actually effectively you would shift the country to the left if you admitted Canada as a part of the United States. Greenland, you don't have that problem because Greenland doesn't have a large enough population, I don't think, to even be considered a state. There's a certain population threshold to be considered a state, and I don't think Greenland meets that threshold. Greenland has less people than Wyoming does. But with that said, buying Greenland is a great idea. Canada, not a great idea. With Canada, you have to work it out economically, and that's a whole nother discussion. As for the geopolitics, Russia wanted to use the Arctic as a trade route going from East Asia to Europe. A lot of that area is ice-free most of the year, and Russia has a significant icebreaker fleet that they just keep that lane clear. Also, Russia had made claims to the Arctic because a lot of the sediments that have settled into the Arctic comes from Russia's rivers. For the Russians to claim the Arctic, the entire Arctic, is actually quite absurd. A lot of sediments come from Alaska and Canada as well. It's just basically it's international waters. I mean, at that point, as far as the geopolitical competition, obviously Russia would have a certain space there. The United States already has some presence there. Obviously, you got Canada there. Greenland, I think that's fine and dandy for the United States to project it out from there. And to put pressure on Russia in that sense is not a bad thing. It'd be easier to work with Russia if some pressure was put onto them. I'm not speaking as a globalist. I understand there's a lot of facets to this. You got Manifest Destiny, you got the neoconservative movement and the globalist movements. I'm not suggesting that we turn to nihilism in this case, or any kind of Trotskyism in the case of neoconservatism. But the specifics of the geopolitical competition could be a whole nother video of in itself. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to comment, and I'll be happy to make another video on this.